with the prosperity of the mid-20th century, increasingly people were looking to national forest land as a place to recreate, applying additional pressure on U.S. Forest Service land and forest resources. The Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act was passed as an official recognition that recreation management, in addition to watershed protection, in addition to wildlife protection, and in addition to timber harvesting, was a priority for the U.S. Forest Service. So the Forest Service now had the ability to garner funding to support this growing recreation program. The problem was that the Act didn't rank the management priorities. So the Act stated that all of these things are priorities for the U.S. Forest Service. It didn't really clarify what was the highest priority and where those priorities were ranked. Was recreation more important than timber harvesting? Was watershed protection more important than recreation? All this was yet to be determined. Post-World War II, there's a paradigm shift within the U.S. Forest Service, where previously the Forest Service viewed itself as an agency primarily focused on the protection of forest resources. With this increased pressure from industry and increased pressure from higher levels of government, the primary concern moved towards the production of timber. So, the harvesting they were conducting was based on concepts of sustained yield. The overall amount of harvesting was really ramped up across the board on national forest land from the 1950s stretching well into the 1980s. The success of the U.S. Forest Service foresters was judged primarily on harvest quotas and their ability to get the cut out. And so at this time, two controversies developed in separate parts of the country as a result of this change in philosophy. The first was in the Bitterroot National Forest in the Northern Rockies. As a means of increasing wood production, the U.S. Forest Service had moved to a system of clear-cut harvesting. They also, on the Bitterroot, they'd terrace steep mountain slopes and plant single species in rows, typically ponderosa pine. And with this activity, there was an increased public concern over aesthetics, over what it looked like. There was an increased concern over water quality, the possibility of erosion as a result of all this terracing. And there was a concern that the U.S. Forest Service really wasn't paying attention to the other priorities that it was supposed to be paying attention to. There was a general lack. The U.S. Forest Service was seen as showing a lack of concern regarding their own multiple-use priorities. And so the public saw an agency more concerned with getting the cut out than providing for any other forest use. And this slide here is just a picture of what that harvesting system consisted of during this time period. If you look up, on the slopes that are cut over, you can see the terraced lines where trees are yet to be planted. The public outcry over this practice led to an internal U.S. Forest Service task force investigation of the Bitterroot National Forest Administration. And so what the task force found is that on the Bitterroot National Forest, insufficient planning was conducted, and it was also found that the National Forest placed timber production well above any other management goal that they supposedly had for the property. An independent investigation was conducted by a University of Montana professor named Arnold Bohl, and he found that multiple-use management didn't even exist as the governing principle on the Bitterroot, and that an agency that was measuring success by goals of timber production was really unable to take into account any other value during planning. Around the same time, on the other side of the country, there was a similar controversy on the Monongalia National Forest in West Virginia. Early on, the harvesting techniques employed on the Monongalia consisted of what we call uneven-aged selection systems. So they were developing forest land with multiple age classes through the harvesting of small groups of trees or single trees at a time at relatively consistent intervals. But by the 1960s, the Forest Administration adopted a policy of what's referred to as even-age management, harvesting whole stands at once. The primary harvesting technique being clear cutting. And this was really driven by two things. First, the economic expediency of harvesting in clear-cut units, and also the emerging scientific evidence that most of the commercially important species in that part of the country, including things like black cherry and yellow poplar, they regenerated best in clear cuts. They grew back well in clear-cut units. The problem was there were really poor guidelines regarding how large clear-cut units should be or how close they should be to one another. And so there was, several instances of very large clear-cut units back to back. You had hundreds of acres cut at a time in really close proximity, creating a controversy among the public, among the local citizens, really similar to that of the folks who lived around the Bitterroot National Forest. What was really interesting in the case on the Monongalia is that the protest was led by a local hunting group who petitioned their local government to enact changes to the U.S. Forest Service policy. The West Virginia Forest Practices Commission deemed that the harvest units were too large, they were too concentrated and too visible, and they made all sorts of recommendations to the U.S. Forest Service. They recommended the use of uneven age harvesting techniques. They recommended that clear cuts should be limited in size to 25 acres. They recommended that other experts should be utilized during the planning process, not just foresters, but ecologists and wildlife biologists. They also recommended that a system of public input should be set up prior, during the planning stages of any of these projects. The problem was that there were harvesting contracts that were developed on the Monongalia prior to this controversy, and so those contracts were carried out, creating the impression among the public that the U.S. Forest Service wasn't listening to their concerns. They were just conducting business as usual, and to some extent they were conducting business as usual. It's just their hands were pretty tied. Environmental groups joined up with the hunters to challenge the U.S. Forest Service based on an interpretation of the Organic Act. Remember, the Organic Act is what gave the U.S. Forest Service the authority to create national forest land. But the Organic Act specifically stated, when you read the fine detail of the thing, specifically stated that only dead, mature, or large growth trees could be harvested. The coalition argued that during clear-cut harvesting far more was removed than what was described within the language of the Organic Act, including younger trees. Ironically, Gifford Bryce Pinchot, who was Gifford Pinchot's only child, Gifford Pinchot's only son, led the efforts of the Natural Resources Defense Council against the U.S. Forest Service, the agency that his father largely built. And so the result of this was legislative action that really determined how the U.S. Forest Service carries out management to this day. The National Forest Management Act of 1976 was legislation that came about as a result, to some extent, of both the Monongalia and Bitterroot controversies. And the Act states that before the U.S. Forest Service implements any management activity, they first must develop a range of alternatives suitable for meeting their objectives. One of those alternatives must always be a no-action alternative that is analyzed side by side with the other alternatives. All management planning now must be interdisciplinary, so it involves not just foresters, but ecologists and biologists and other scientists. There is a built-in process for land suitability classification under the National Forest Management Act as well. But perhaps the most important part of the legislation is the required input from public stakeholders. As a result of the National Forest Management Act, there's now a formalized process for public involvement, and citizens can voice support or opposition to the U.S. Forest Service based on the management alternatives that are proposed. Like all federal agencies, the Forest Service is guided by the NEPA process, and NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires the creation of environmental impact statements and environmental assessments for all land management projects on federal land. NEPA and the National Forest Management Act really kind of opened the door for advocacy groups in disagreement with the U.S. Forest Service to utilize litigation as a way to put the brakes on U.S. Forest Service projects, timber harvesting in particular. And that's really had a big impact on the way the Forest Service has handled their mission over the last couple decades. And that really brings us up to speed. As you can see at the bottom of this last slide here, the U.S. Forest Service is the most litigated federal agency that we have, with most lawsuit activities centered on timber harvesting activities in particular. Though not legislation, the U.S. Forest Service is now operating under a new internal planning rule enacted in 2012, which focuses land management activities on goals of forest restoration and ecological restoration. The language on the slide is taken directly from that planning rule, so just to gives you an idea of what the direction that this planning rule is taking. Currently, the management plans for the Pisgah and Nantahala National Forests in western North Carolina are being updated as two of the first national forests to be developed under this new rule. As you can imagine, given such a long history of land use in the southern Appalachians, restoration as a management goal or as an objective is really tricky. But what it amounts to is the U.S. Forest Service now determines a desirable ecological condition for all forest land within a management unit and proposes management activities to move towards that condition. Activities proposed are really varied, but they could include timber harvesting, they could include prescribed fire, invasive species control, and so forth. But the objective is always ecologically based. The timber harvesting goals are set, they're met through the broader objectives of ecological restoration. And we'll get into the specifics of restoration as a management goal later in the semester, because it's sort of a complicated way to look at management. But that's it for this week. So take care, and we'll catch up with you next week.